Today we're going to talk about the Declaration of Independence. On the 4th of July, 1776, the Second Continental Congress formally adopted the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia, creating the United States of America as an independent country free from the Empire of Great Britain. American independence and the war that followed represents the triumph and the defense and the emergence of the natural law as the basis for right ordering societies, in particular because the natural law is accessible to all human beings through the use of reason, and in particular, the natural law in the context of the American Declaration of Independence is to establish a number of principles essential for the right ordering of domestic and international society. In the Declaration, we see the four principles that I have talked about before. The focus or the primacy of the person. When governments focus on the person or the primacy of the person, then you have a very powerful check on tyranny, on the misuse of governments. You have a very powerful check against wars, against poverty, against all manner of suffering. The government, to be right ordered and not be tyrannical, is to exist for the benefit of all the people. And that is essential to, and in that regard, it is essential to understand that the person must be the focus of the government's efforts. Not the ethnic group, not the church, the person. Okay, so then the next point, aside from the primacy or focus of the person, the desire for peace as the end of temporal activity. You see that in the Declaration of Independence. The existence of a community of nations and the importance of the rule of law. All these things are in the Declaration of Independence. It starts with the very profound preamble, which we memorized when we were kids, which is, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people, this is very important, one people, the American people, to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, the British, the English, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitles them, which is the natural law. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. End of quote. You see right there the reliance on the natural law. Not only does the natural law give certain rights and duties to the person, not only does the natural law orient government to the person, to serving the person, but also the natural law forms the community of nations and the relations between these nations so that the person and his family can be properly taken care of, benefited, developed. America understood this from the beginning, from the Declaration of Independence, and we understood that, as I've told you before, by reading the Law of Nations, Emer de Vattel's Law of Nations, and also by reading Algernon Sidney and Cato's letters and things like that, which came out of England, came through England, and which I've talked about before with Robert Riley's book, America on Trial. So the Declaration proceeds to the purposes of government and the rights of the people, all based on the natural law. And so it starts with, as we know, quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." End of quote. This is from the School of Salamanca. This is from St Thomas Aquinas as it came through two different means, Algernon and Sidney, the other one being the Law of Nations that was passed down from Grotius, School of Salamanca to Grotius de Vattel. And the founders read this and they understood that. They understood these concepts. And what they are saying here is that if you have a right-ordered society, you're looking after the person's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, 1776 is a point in time. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But there is a context in which this comes clear. Um, Robert Riley makes it very clear in his book, America on Trial, that America was a restoration of the natural law. John Courtney Murray said America was the restoration of the dual swords, the dual kingdoms, if you will, because what had happened is with Great Britain or England, the king was the same as the head of the church. So you had a theocracy. You had those two kingdoms united. What you had with the Hobbesian view of government, of governance, you had this totalitarian rule that just simply crushed the people. Might makes right, right does not make might. And America understood that this was wrong. And so we recognized the natural law and we implemented the natural law from the beginning with the Declaration of Independence, which said that persons have rights to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and that it is for this purpose that governments are instituted among men. They're not instituted for the king to make money or for the church to be powerful. They're not instituted for the purpose of waging war to conquer territory or to crush your enemies or to crush your own citizens. They're not instituted for the purpose of accumulating as much glory as the leaders want. They are instituted for the purpose of protecting life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, Emer de Vattel, I've talked about before, has talked about the basic purposes of domestic governments. And he says it's basically security, provide the necessities, and provide for happiness. Security is pretty much self-explanatory. You keep the peace in the country. You also protect the people. And at this point, what I want to say too is given that there is this big debate about birthright citizenship, what you notice with Emer de Vattel, who the founders believed very, very closely in, they read him, they accepted what he said. What you see with Emer de Vattel is that the idea of nation is not just blood and soil. It is the polity. It is everybody in the country. So that means that the government exists for everybody in the country, not just a few, not just, Germans or Irish or Italians or Hungarians, not just white people or black people, but for all the people. And that the best way to do that was through the natural law, recognizing the primacy of the person, protecting those rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, now Vattel also said that there were necessities that had to be provided. And this is where he talks about this idea of providential destination, where you're supposed to develop the earth. You're supposed to go forth, as God said in Genesis, and subdue the earth and make it fruitful and multiply. Okay? That is the soil, develop the soil, commerce, methods of exchange. He says that. This is what governments are supposed to allow and supposed to provide. And this has always been deeply in the American intellectual DNA. Okay? And this, being so deeply in our DNA, led to a conflict with Britain, as I'll explain in a minute. The third thing that governments are supposed to do is to ensure the happiness of the citizenry. I'm trying to read my writing here, which is to provide liberty, which is to provide and protect religion, allow people to exercise their religion, give them justice and equity, provide justice, take care of the courts and stuff like that, and basically education and things that develop the person. Okay, you're supposed to develop the person again. All right, and religion helps develop the person. Education helps develop the person. Giving people liberty so they don't live in fear to do the things that they're called to do or need to do. This is all part of the function of government, as per Vattel. So when and this is all in accordance with the natural law. The natural law came out from Salamanca, Thomas Aquinas before that, and went on through Grotius and on up to our day. The reference to powers in the government is very important because this idea of powers was something Bellarmine and Suarez talked about all the time. So this focus on powers is something which is well founded. And what our forefathers were basically saying is that the people hold the power in society, and they give what powers they want to the government. Okay, and God, in a roundabout way, he ordains the government through the people, and the people give powers to that government, and the government exists, to operate, to govern in accordance with God's law. That's how it exists. So you give powers, and the government is supposed to act in accordance with God's law and not be tyrannical. Um, okay, so we know the purpose of the government. We know that it's to recognize the human being as a person and not as a thing. And like I said, this is during a time of great war and poverty, religious disputes, and so on. The next section of the Declaration precedes the grievances. There are 27. What I think is important is the following. Quote, when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, them referring to the colonies, end of quote. The 27 grievances, in other words, were an example or were part of a design, of a plan by the English to reduce the colonists under absolute despotism. Okay, these are important concepts. Now, the examples, when you say you reduce to absolute despotism, that means you're not an Englishman anymore. Because Englishmen had rights. And what is shown in the list of grievances is those rights were denied the Englishmen. And this is well documented. This is what James Otis fought as early as 1760 and 1761, where the Admiralty courts just simply took people and tried them in England, without a jury, oftentimes. Well, that's against the rights of Englishmen, and that's against natural law rights. So what you had is you had the colonies being reduced to despotism, losing their rights as Englishmen, no longer being Englishmen, basically. And what the grievances set out is they talk about this right to trial, the right to be tried by your peers and not in an admiralty court. They talk about the loss of property, the taking of property, which was a very big deal to the English. And the taking of property goes way back. The Glorious Revolution in 1688-89 reaffirmed this principle that Englishmen have a right to property. And the one thing the Catholic King James II did, and this is from a book by John Miller. I got it around here somewhere. Here it is. It's a book by John Miller. It is considered one of the best books about James II. James II, A Study in Kingship, came out in 77, 78. One of the best studies of James II. He basically said that James II, despite saying he was going to honor everyone's right to property, actually took their property. and he ruled by decree. He was the Catholic king. He was a zealot, and he was not prudent. He was not very smart. And so he caused a lot of problems. But property, the point is, property is very important to the English. The colonies were being attacked by the king. The state was attacked by the king and by the parliament, by the English government. And the English government was controlled by about 10,000 plutocrats, according to Charles Beard. And Charles Beard says these were the landed estates, these were the guys with the money, these were the guys with the power in Parliament, which was very powerful. Some say perhaps all powerful. But these were the guys who basically could use the colonies as they wanted to help their bottom line. Because the aristocracy, the 10,000 plutocrats, these were the guys who ran the businesses, the trade, and were involved in all manners of making money. And what they did is they sloughed off their losses on the colonies. That's what they did. Okay. But what also happened, the state is attacked and destroyed. So what I mean by that, and what is in the grievances set forth, is that the governments of the colonies were actually destroyed by the parliament. And so the people cannot govern themselves. Judiciary was tampered with. Of course, westward expansion was stopped. What a lot of people also don't know is that trade was greatly restricted. That was one of the grievances. And trade is a natural law right of people. And all these things violated this idea of the rule of law and of the law of nations, because that's the natural law, and natural law is part of the rule of law. So all of these things were destroyed by the English government and were harmed by the English government. And the American people really were not considered British. Um, Following that part, there's a discussion of the attempts by the Americans to have peace. That's the October 1774 petition. Um, Americans wanted to stay with the British. They wanted to make the empire even stronger. That's why they wanted their rights. They wanted certain autonomy. They wanted to make certain decisions, certain representation. And then finally, then we get into the final commentary, which talks about the community of nations. And it is that the USA is a free and independent state, quote, and they have full powers, they meaning the United States, have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all acts and things which independent states may have a right to do, end of quote. And then it invokes God's help, and for the support of this declaration with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor, end of quote. That is clearly a community of nations. We're joining community of nations. We're joining together as a people, all different religions, all different ethnicities. We're joining together as a people, as a nation, and we are seeking to establish a government based on articles of peace, basically, was not the case in Europe. Um, so let's go on to some key considerations. I always try to keep these things short, but I look at the time and I just keep going. But I've got to explain this. Okay, so there's several things that I think people miss. I'm going to talk about 6 or 7 things. First of all, go a little bit out of order. First of all, America did not overthrow a tyrant. America came into being as a separate country. That's a real important distinction. Okay, it was a colony before, or 13 colonies, which I want to talk about. And so, in a way, there was a gap, okay, in thinking about what you do with colonies. At some point, what happens to colonies? And so, what Americans did is they looked back at history. So they looked back at custom. Custom forms the law of nations. It forms part of this idea of how we're supposed to interact internationally. And Americans look back, and I think one of the best, and a number of them looked at it, but one of the best was by a guy called Novalingus in 1774. He wrote an article, and he looked at the Greek colonies, and other founders did this too. He looked at the Greek colonies, and he looked at the Roman colonies. And what the Greeks did is they founded colonies and they said, okay, you're on your own. The Romans did the same thing for Italy. Okay, you're on your own. When these countries conquered people, they didn't establish colonies. They conquered them. They exercised despotic control over them. And so what you had is this history meeting the School of Salamanca, the natural law tradition that St Thomas Aquinas started, and this or found, and this is this idea that he puts forth, and that the School of Salamanca carried forward, among other things, that you're supposed to help colonies to a certain point, and then the idea, though it wasn't so clearly expressed, is that they can then go on their own. That wasn't so clearly expressed, but what Epstein says in his book, the Catholic Tradition of the Law of Nations, he writes, this is 1935, jus gentium, which is St. Thomas Aquinas' term, as law of nations in the sense of the modern nation. Rather, we should paraphrase it, the body of rights belonging to all peoples, whatever the actions of their birth, which should be respected in their mutual relations, such as the right to conserve themselves in being, to develop according to their nature, to hold property, to bequeath it, to trade, to travel freely, to which we might add the right to speak their maternal language, to follow their own domestic and religious customs, so they be not contrary to natural law, to choose or obey their own local authorities. It is in part to protect these rights that first civil society, then international society is formed. Jus gentium is in a sense the end to which the international law is the means for the object and conventions between states is directly or indirectly to promote the welfare of the families that uh, compose them, and this welfare comprises the free exercise of all the rights contained in the Jus Gentium. So what Epstein is talking about here is that peoples have a right to be governed by their own and to basically prosper on their own. And what you had in America was a separate people by 1770, completely separate people from the English. And so what the English were doing was destroying those people, limiting their ability to conduct trade, to expand, to cultivate the land. What you have to understand is that um, the colonies were limited on what they could manufacture. They were just a source of raw materials. They were just a source of raw materials, okay? And these were materials that went back to England that helped England's wealth, more properly helped the wealth of the plutocrats, the 10,000 who ran all the industries back there manufacturing things, okay? So what you had was the colonies as a source of raw materials. They could not make specie, they couldn't make money, they couldn't make the coin to pay the taxes they had to pay. The Currency Act limited the making of paper money. That hurt their ability to trade and to carry on economic activity within the colonies. Um, and then you had all of these other acts, the Townshend Acts, the Sugar Act, all these other acts that came after 1763. And all these acts came after 1763 for the purpose of the plutocrats to shift the cost of the latest war, the 7 Years' War, to shift that cost onto the colonies. And the colonies had already borne about half the cost of that war. But the plutocrats in England wanted the colonies to bear more, okay? In addition to that, the colonies, they're Englishmen, right? Under the Magna Carta, under the Bill of Rights of 1689, they had certain rights, right to representation. Well, guess what? The colonists, even though they were Englishmen, didn't have any of those rights. The Constitution did not allow them to exercise those rights, and the government did not allow them to exercise those rights, which is representation. In the parliament, they had no representation. They sent agents over, but they had no representation. So this was a very serious problem with the English Constitution, and it took away the rights of the Englishmen, and so the actions of the government took away the rights of the Englishmen because of this defect in the Constitution, because of the tyrannical nature of the government itself. Okay, so a new country is formed with America. Vattel talks about that, by how it's settled. America was settled by private interests, with the exception of Georgia, and of the 13 colonies. But America was, and this was a point that was made over and over again in the ideological wars of the 1760s and the 1770s, and that could not be disputed. What you had was a new country, a new people, which had all these rights: the right to trade, the right to make the earth fruitful, to expand, to have their own money, all of these things that a people are allowed to have, and the government of England was going to give it to them. And that is because, point number two, because the colonies were money-making machines. Because what you had is you had a mercantilist system, okay, which is kind of what other countries have now, which is what the current regime in America wants, a mercantilist system, where you have colonies that are basically you use, okay? And England did that all around the world, okay? England did that all around the world with other colonies. They just used them for the purposes of helping their industries, helping their currency, helping them to compete. America was a money-making machine, and I submit to you that mercantilism fundamentally goes against the natural law and even against God's explicit orders to go out and be fruitful and multiply, because mercantilism just benefits the certain people in the home country, and it does not allow for creation to go forth, for people to be creative, to make things, to till the soil, to mine, to manufacture, to do any of a number of things, to invent. This, I think, gave a great impetus to our economic system, which is a form of capitalism. And that's to cooperate with God in creation and to make sure of this natural law right, or obligation of providential destination. In other words, taking the fruits of this piece of earth and sharing them with the rest of the world. That's what Americans were about. That's not what mercantilism and the English were about. They were saying we're gonna take your stuff to make us rich, and you're just gonna have to suffer. One thing that and this was noted by Thomas Pownall, who was a former governor, and also too was noted by Ben Franklin. Okay, so what you also have to understand is what the English were doing as part of this mercantilism was to pass the Tea Act. This wasn't about cheaper tea. This was about destroying American industry. So let's see, we couldn't make stuff, we couldn't expand, we couldn't make money. Uh, and now you pass the Tea Act, which destroys all of our intermediate industries that sold and brokered tea. And you had to buy from the East India Company, which was owned by the aristocrats in England, by the plutocrats in England, which just Parliament just swept away all these American industries. Well, that's catastrophic. That would be, somebody said that'd be like Standard Oil getting a law passed saying you have to buy only from Standard Oil gas stations, and all these others are gone. It's just This is catastrophic. It destroys your ability to provide for your family, to develop the earth, to be creative, to bring forth the fruits of the earth. This is catastrophic. That's what the Americans were fighting, and still, we ask for a peaceful resolution and right ordering of the relationship to improve the British Empire. But the British didn't want that. Okay, so then that brings us to the third point. A lot of people talk about was George III. Well, there was a plutocracy. They were tyrannical, and so the ideas of tyranny played in here. They were a part of this calculation of the colonies going out and starting our own country because we were a different people. And so these ideas of what a tyrant is came from St. Thomas, from the Salamanca school, from Grotius Vitel. And basically, and Bellarmine and Suarez, that's involved in there. Basically, a tyrant is somebody who destroys the state, uses the government for their own benefit, which we had in as concerns the American colonies. The English government, the king with the oligarchs, with the plutocrats, with the aristocrats who owned all the businesses, were basically destroying the state and using America for their own private good. And also, too, if a tyrant is somebody who wars against their own people, well, we have that. Okay, the Declaration of Independence sets that forth. Again, these ideas go back to Bellarmine, Suarez, School of Salamanca. These ideas came down to the Americans to our forefathers through Grotius and Vitel, and through Sidney Algernon, as Robert Riley explains. Jonathan Mayhew was a Congregationalist preacher. He said, rulers do not have absolute right to do whatever they want. They got to do what God wants them to do, and we can resist tyranny, we can oppose tyranny, is what he said. Um, and this is what America was basically about. It was about we have to do something against tyranny, because that brings me to my fourth point, which is that we existed in a time and place. And I'm going to tell you something, folks. I mean, there are these fairy tales going on out there that, life was great during the Baroque period. Life was great in Europe in the 1700s, and life was great in Europe in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. It was just wonderful. No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't. It was horrible. Okay. It was horrible. If you weren't born in the right family, you had a subsistence living, a shortened life, you were sick, you worked all the time, you had no rights, you were nothing. They didn't even know your name. Okay, that's the truth. Okay, and so America came about in this time and this place. And so what I do is I take a look at what was going on. What about the wars? So in the 1700s alone, there were 10 to 15 major international wars and regional campaigns in Europe. Okay, the Great Northern War, War of Spanish Succession, War of Polish Succession, War of Austrian Succession, 7 Years' War, Bavarian Succession, Russo-Turkish Wars. 4 million were killed in these wars in the 1700s up to 1776. 4 million died because somebody wanted power, because some king, some tyrant, some monarch wanted power. Succession, that means they want the power. I mean, you're fighting to die. I mean, can't we do this an easier way? Let's have an election. Let's do that, okay? That way we don't have to fight and die and have our families destroyed and have our lives upended. So you can have more power. And so what you had was horrible time. It was a horrible time in the 1700s. A lot of people forget about the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War ended in 1648. Okay, that's 100 and what? Less than 130 years of the Declaration of Independence. This is in Americans' minds. What was the 30 Years' War? It was nationalism and religion. 8 million people died. Up to half of Central Europe was destroyed. 8 million people died in the 30 Years' War. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of suffering, a lot of killing. And then you've got, in the 17th century in general, you got 30 to 40 million killed. The wars were about empire building, succession, religion, nationalism. Well, all of these things ignored the person. Okay, because these were tyrannical governments. These were autocratic governments. Okay? And they came up with these causes to motivate the people to go out and die. So the aristocracy, the 5 or 10%, they had everything, or most of things. America said the person matters. It was a pushback against absolutism. So we got to stop this stuff. And this idea you can see again in the 20th century with Cordell Hull, and you can see this idea with the other American international thinkers, scholars, lawyers, of the value of the person to offset nationalism, tyranny, runaway religion. And all these things now, runaway religion, tyranny, nationalism, is coming back. And the post-liberals are helping bring it back. And they and a lot of other people have forgotten the horrors that engenders, that post-liberalism engenders. America said the person matters. And so we got back to the natural law. It was an antidote to a very bloody system of government that Christianity could not check. But America, with its focus on the person, rule of law, desire for peace, and idea that we're holistic, we're a domestic society, an international society, we've got to work together. America was a check on tyranny, nationalism, and this runaway religion. Next item, that what the Declaration of Independence shows is the people of agency. They have the will. The power rests with us. We see this even today. We see this in the Balkans in the 1870s, Greece in the 1820s. Today we see it in Georgia, Serbia, Hungary, Ukraine, even a little bit in Russia. We see it. This idea that the people have agency. They're not just some CIA color revolution. People actually have agency. They want freedom. That's why Franco fell. That's why Salazar fell. That's why all the dictators in history fall, Ceausescu, because the people want freedom. They want their natural law of rights. Because that's a check to tyranny. It's a check to war and poverty. Okay, so, the Catholics, I haven't found any church condemnation of the American independence. Bishop Carroll highly praised it. He highly praised Washington and the American institutions. Um, and so what we have is a system that, focusing on the person and benefiting the person, reduces a lot of the horrors uh, that humanity has encountered. And at the same time, what it does um, is it takes away the absolutism of government. And this is why tyrants, this is why Putin, this is why the tech bros and the post-liberals have got to destroy America. They have to destroy this idea of exceptionalism. And essential to this idea of exceptionalism is that the people realize we have agency, that we have value aside from what the government says, that it comes from God through the natural law, and governments are supposed to protect that. We're not supposed to be profit marks or sources of pleasure for the powerful. Happy Independence Day.